And hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So in this video, we'll be covering functions. Now before we get into the video, I have a new way of compiling my code. It is actually the same thing, but it's in alias. I'll explain what that is in a second. So usually if I compile my code, I'll say g++ main.cpp-o output and then run that output file, and then if I run it, then we get this. I found this to be too long, and because all of my files, especially when I do tutorials, is always main.cpp-o output and even some very basic programs or this, I decided I'm going to create an alias so I don't have to do this anymore. So if I were to just open up my bash rc, then here we go. So if I go all the way down, as you can see, I have an alias called cpile, and that just means I can type cpile here and it will execute this code for me. I have a bunch of things here, for example, image for this piece of text that I always forget because sxiv, that's very difficult to remember, aim player because I always watch with 4 frames and that this aspect ratio, and then with Django, I can just say python manage.py, or I can say DJ, and then I'm good to go. And in cpile is, of course, all of this, but now I don't have to type all of this. I can just say cpile. So that is what I did. I added that alias. So that's pretty neat. So I can just say cpile. Whoa. There we go. As you can see there, we get hello world. Cool. Now let's get into the video. So, what is a function? Well, you actually kind of already have seen a function and have been working with it for quite a while. This right here, this is called the main function. The main function of the program. It's the main part of this language. If you execute a piece of code, it's going to search for this main function. But what if I told you we can make our own functions to work with this main function? For example, and just bear with me, I'll explain all of this in a second. Void say hello. And now here we can just say cout hello. And now I'm just going to go here and say hello. If I were to compile and run this, you'll get hello. So we basically created a function. This right there, that's a function. It kind of behaves the same as this main function right here in a lot of similar ways. There are a few differences here and there. So what does this void mean before we get into a function itself? Void means it doesn't return anything. As you can see here, we have a return 0. And here we have an int, because this function right here returns an integer, as you can see right there. This is what it returns, and then with return you can return something. So if this was to be, let's say, an int, then I'll have to say return, and I'll have to like put a number in here for it to return. Void, it just means it doesn't return anything. It's basically just executing some code. Cool. So that's the basics of a function. You can later on then call that function. So let's say this function has a ton of lines. Now instead of having to copy and paste all of these, let's see, 12 lines, is that 12 lines? Yes, all of these 12 lines, you can just, boom. And now it's 12, 24, 60, 36, 48, and I believe that's 60. So it's 60 lines of just hello. So yeah. That is what's very useful of functions. So you can call a function over and over and over again to basically give you the output you want. It's kind of a way to stop you from copying and pasting code. Like you could just create a function here and then use that function at multiple places instead of having to copy and paste the code every time. Cool. Now let's say we have a function that returns hello and then the user. For example, hello Jack. Now the thing is, how do we know the user's name is Jack? Well, we can actually set that. by going here, these arguments, we can give our own arguments. I'm going to say std : string, and I'm going to call it name. This means we can enter a name here, and that name we can now do this with. So it's just like using a normal variable, but it's now inside of here. So now, as you can see, we have a little red line here because it's asking for this name variable right here. So if I were to pass in, let's say Luke. Now, if I were to run this, we'll get hello Luke. So we just made our code dynamic. By passing something in here, we can change the output every time. So let's paste this 3 times and say Mark. And now here we can say Jack. Now if we were to run this, we'll get hello Luke, hello Mark, and hello Jack. So you can insert a bunch of variables in here, a bunch of arguments. Cool. Now let's use a different example. Let's maybe use a function that will return the sum of something. For example, float sum. And in here we want to take in 2 numbers, a float num1 and float num2. And then we can say return num1 plus num2. Okay, now let's quickly explain this because to some this might still be like a foreign language. What did we just do? Well, we created a function called sum. This function will return a floating point value. This could also have been a double or an integer depending on what you prefer. Now we're also taking in floating point values, so 2 float numbers, so 0.12 or 5.37, and they were returning it. Of course, this could have been splitted into multiple lines. For example, we could have said float answer is equal to num1 plus num2, and then we could have returned answer. That would have been fine as well. I just made it 1 line because it was just as simple, because you could have just passed this in. You might want to say something like cout calculating dot and then returning the number. So yeah, we can do that. And now if we go down here, we can say sum, and let's say 2.8 and 3.1415. Take note, it returns something, so we need to actually catch that return, otherwise it's not going to do anything for us. So we can say here, let's say float number is equal to sum, and then with those numbers passed in, and then we can cout number and number. This might look a bit confusing, but let's just run it so you can just see what we get. So first we get calculating. So what's happening here is when we run this sum, it's going to say calculating. It's going to get that value, that answer, and it's going to pass it in to return. Whatever is inside of return will be passed into this right here. And since this returns a float, this also has to be a float. You could have also, if you didn't want to put this inside of a variable, you could have just done this. That would have been perfectly fine as well, because this return would then just have replaced here. So now if we run it, we'll still get the same output. And we're actually getting number calculating, which is really interesting, because we're putting it here. So it's a number, and then we're actually printing out calculating while it's still printing out. So that's why we're getting that. So it's actually better if you were to then just do this, because then you would get the normal one. But yeah, let's do another example. Instead of using, let's say, a float, let's do maybe cubing. You of course don't have to do math with it. I'm just doing math because that's what I find the easiest to kind of do, to kind of show examples with, because it's so simple. So let's say int cube, and in here we can say that is equal, and in here we can just say int num. Of course, this doesn't necessarily have to be an integer. This could be a float as well, but then we don't have to convert it from an integer to a float because it returns an int. So then we can just say return num times num times num, like that. And then here we can just say cube, and let's say 5. So that's 5 times 5 times 5, which should be about 125. Yes, there we go. You can also give things default values. For example, let's go back to the function say hello, and let's make this time return something instead. String say hello. And here we can say std string name, and I'm going to say is equal to Jack. And then here we can say return hello, and then we can just pass in Jack, like that. And then here we can say hello, and that should not be hello Jack, that should be name, like that. And in here we should also just do that. Now if we were to run this, we'll get hello Jack. And that's the nice thing about this. We can give it a default value for in case someone doesn't enter a value. So it will be hello Jack. But if we were to change this from Jack to, let's say, Mike, then it won't say hello Jack, it will say hello Mike. So that's a nice thing. You can give these variables or these arguments, you can give them default values. So later on, you can use them without a problem. So you can either add a value in there, or if you don't necessarily want to add a value, you don't have to. So yeah. Now one last thing before we continue is, what if you want to have this main function on top? Because I know some people prefer having their main function at the top because it's their main function. That's the main thing you would want to look at. But the problem is, if we were to do this, it will cause a problem. Because of how C++ reads code, it reads from top to bottom. So by doing this, C++ does not know say hello exists, because it goes through and it's like, okay, let's run here. It doesn't see anything yet. It just goes, oh, say hello. But it doesn't know what say hello is because it hasn't read it yet. So now if we were to try and run it, we'll get a problem because say hello was not declared, even though we declared it down here. So a way to get around that is to just copy this right here, go up here, paste it, and just remove the defaults. This will tell C++ this function does exist, but we declared it somewhere else. So C++ will know this exists because we told it it exists, even though we first declared what it actually does down here. So if we were to run it now, we'll get hello Mike. So what if we wanted to, let's say, do this? Well, there's a problem. C++ doesn't know that there's a default value. So we can move that default value from down there and put it up there. My bad for actually removing it at the start because it's actually kind of required if you want it. Then if you run it, you get hello Jack. Take note, you should not have your default argument here anymore. It should be here, not here. If it's here, you're going to get an error. If it's on both, you're going to get an error. So it should be here. So C++ knows that it has a default value. Otherwise, it's not going to know it has a default value, and when it gets here, it's going to be like, oh, that's kind of strange. So yeah. And that's the basics of functions. It's as simple as that. I do recommend you play around with this because functions is a very important topic in any programming language. If there's something you don't understand, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. And thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all again in the next C++ tutorial.